let's have a look at the fundamental factor model. For the fundamental factor model, the factors are attributes of stocks or companies that are important in explaining cross-sectional difference in stock prices. So in the fundamental factor model, we use the cross-sectional data. So I will show you how to do this fundamental cross-sectional analysis in the Excel. And then let's have a look. The second point is our assets return can be explained by the price-earning ratio, market capitalization. So that's the equation for our fundamental factor model. But here the FPE and F size are not the factor means. So this is our factor here, the BI1 and BI2. So what's the BI1? That's the attribute, the sensitivity attribute, the factor attribute. So BI1 should equal to our I's attribute value minus the average attribute value divided by the standard deviation of attribute value. Maybe it is hard for you to understand that, but I will show you an example to explain that. So if you are consider that the P as the one of the factor could explain the assets return. So the BI1 should equal to your Guizhou Maotai's PE minus the whole portfolio's all the assets, the average PE. So if in your analyst study, in your empirical study, you have 30 stocks. So that's your cross-sectional data. So here you have Guizhou Maotai's return, Wu Liangye's return in 230 stocks here. And here you have your Guizhou Maotai's B1 and Wu Liangye's B1, etc. So that's the cross-sectional. All the data come here together is based on different companies. It's not based on the time series. And here, the PE average is all these 30 stocks average PE. And then we divide by the PE standard deviation. That's the whole 30 stocks average PE standard deviation. Okay, then you can solve this PE. You move this in this equation and run our equation, get the final result. So here in your fundamental factor model, definitely this alpha I is not expected return. So compare with our macroeconomic factor model with fundamental factor model. Here is the alpha I is not expected return in microeconomic factor model. And in microeconomic factor model, BI is the slope estimation slope. But here in the fundamental factor model, this BI we calculate by ourselves. And here the FPE is our regression result, regression coefficient. So that's the basic difference between these two models. Okay, after introduce the fundamental factor model, we will compare both of them, the macroeconomic factor model and fundamental factor model. Let's have a look. The most difference between them is microeconomic factor model, the factor sensitivity, BI1, BI2 is based on our regression slope. So that is run your regression and get your regression slope here. And the second, for the fundamental factor model, our sensitivity factor is based on the attribute. So it's our attribute value, attribute sensitivity. It's like in the previous slide. And BI is calculated this way. So here, this is attribute. And the second difference is for the risk factors. For microeconomic factor model, the factors are surprise. You remember that the GDP surprise or QS surprise, quality surprise. And for fundamental factor model, these factors are our regression result. And the third difference, as I mentioned, that the macroeconomic factor model, the intercept is our expected return, that's ERI. And for our fundamental factor model, there is no economic interpretation. It's just the intercept from your regression result. And finally, the difference between these two models is the macroeconomic factor model, we use time series data. So if we consider 贵州茅台's return, we will use the 贵州茅台's different time period, each one by one day, and run the regression. But for the fundamental factor model, we will basically use this cross-sectional data, which is include different stocks in your data and run this. So as I mentioned, I use 30 or 50 or 100 stocks. So that's the cross-sectional data. Okay, that's the difference between macroeconomic factor model with fundamental factor models. Okay, the last one we will discuss was the difference between our multi-factor model with APT model. The first difference is based on dependent variable. The multi-factor model, the dependent variable is actual return. So that's RI. And for APT model, our dependent variable is ERI. So that's the big difference between these two models. And the second one is the error term. This is epsilon I. So for the multi-factor model, especially in the macroeconomic factor model, we have the, yes, definitely we have the epsilon I, which this epsilon I denote the firm-specific risk surprise. And the second, for the APT model, we don't include this error term. The reason we don't include the error term is because we ran this model is based on expected return. So if we run the expected return, and what's the difference between expected return and our actual return? Definitely we should add our epsilon I. So that's the difference between these two. Okay, the next one is the intercept for these two factor models. For the multi-factor models, the intercept for microeconomic is ERI. And for the fundamental factor models, which is your regression result. And for the APT model, we have the lambda 0 or RF. And the risk for multi-factor model, we include systematic risk and unsystematic risk. Because for the systematic risk, we consider the market risk, but for the unsystematic and other factor risk. And for the unsystematic risk, we consider our error term firm-specific risk. And for the APT model, because we only consider the expected return, so we assume that unsystematic risk can be well diversified away, so we only include systematic risk. The last one is about the assumptions. For the multi-factor model, we don't have lots of assumptions for these multi-factor models. For the APT model, we have one assumption need to mention, which is no arbitrage opportunity. So if there no arbitrage opportunity exists, we can APT model could hold. So that's the difference between multifactor model with APT model. Okay, in today's lecture, we have learned different types of multifactor model, include the microeconomic factor model, fundamental factor model, and statistical factor model. And then we compare the microeconomic with the fundamental factor model. And last, we compare the multifactor model with APT models. That's all for today's class. Thank you.